So I've just watched a somewhat depressing but also insightful report on CNN about the current situation in Xinjiang, which lies within China's Western Territory. Um, it's it's really staggering to think that this may be the largest mass incarceration of people since World War II, and yet there really is global silence. Many situations are described as global silence, but with this, there really is global silence. Very few governments, if any, have actively spoken out against what's going on in Xinjiang. So, the report was led by Matt Rivers, very brave journalist, and it was about a man who was trying to find out the fate of his wife. Young guy, young woman. Now, these people were clearly not hardline Islamists. They weren't even Islamists. She wasn't wearing any sort of veil or niqab or not. I'm not saying that automatically makes one an Islamist, but there was absolutely no indicator that these people had any sort of hardline Islamist views whatsoever. Um, but they're Uyghurs. That's their crime. They're ethnic Uyghurs. What China is doing is absolutely repugnant. And it's almost laughable that they think that those of us who are paying attention will be taken in by the propaganda that these prison camps are just voluntary re-education centres or voluntary vocational centres. That's how they put it. Absolutely pathetic. I mean, when Matt Rivers and his team tried to film at the sites, because they were trying to trace this man's wife, who'd done absolutely nothing wrong, she hadn't been charged with any sort of terrorist offence, yet she just went missing. Um, of course, they had their heavies to, get worked up and try to shoo the team away. Now, here's the interesting thing, and I can actually relate to what this could mean. The team was then followed. They had to leave. They had to got a rather cranky female guard, ask them in English why were they there, what had they heard, and so on. Anyway, they were followed. I believe this was just outside Kashgar. They were followed, and these people then coerced them, pressured them into having dinner together, where they had to endure this pathetic situation of local officials dancing away merrily, um, getting drunk, no doubt, in Baijiu, and just pretending like nothing was wrong. And the team, Matt Rivers and his team, robustly refused to do that, but they really had no choice. Now, I say I can relate to that. I know that in China, dinner eating is a big social thing. So I suspect this was a way of the local authorities, the local officials, of trying to soften the CNN team up, trying to get them to be silent. Well, they failed. And that is a mark of good journalism. Huge respect to Matt Rivers and his team for doing this important report. But, it's just pathetic. And it's disgusting what the Chinese regime is doing there, because this is just collective punishment of all Uyghurs. Um, and I think it is an attempt basically to eradicate Islam within China's borders. Now, my whole life, or at least as long as I've been following current affairs, I've been a vocal critic of pan-Islamist extremism. I've been a vocal critic of those who say Islam cannot be questioned, and I've been a vocal advocate for tackling Islamic extremism. China, like every country, has a right to protect its borders. But here's the thing, there hasn't been a hardline Islamist presence in China. So there's really no reason, not that there would be an excuse for collective punishment anyway, but in the Chinese context, there really isn't a reason for that. I'm not saying there is absolutely no Islamism on the ground, but here's the irony. The more cruel and the more hardline the Chinese regime gets, then the higher the chances are of some point Islamists actually going into that ground. Now, my criticism is not only at China and its cruelty and its lies, but also the utter hypocrisy of Islamic states. Whilst they're busy vilifying Israel, when a country like Pakistan or Indonesia or Malaysia has protests and tries to push for action against Israel at the UN, and their citizens get angry about Israel, where on earth is the outrage about the plight of the Uyghurs just across the border? On the contrary, Pakistan does expensive trade deals. Saudi Arabia does expensive trade deals. So the hypocrisy of the Islamic world is pathetic. Whilst Israel really is protecting its borders, China is persecuting um, Uyghurs by the million. I mean, this is a frightening situation and it's absolutely appalling. But I mentioned my position on Islamism. There will be some in the West, particularly on the right, who will be tempted to say, "Oh, well done, China. They're taking on Islam, and they're finally standing up to the Muslims." But the people who have that mentality, as far as I'm concerned, are just anti-Muslim bigots. They're not anti-Islamists. They're anti-Muslims. There is a difference. And if you support the mass incarceration of Muslims, I mean, this is sinister what's going on right now. And my question to any Chinese apologists who come here and say, "Oh, this is Western propaganda," or "you don't know what you're talking about," etc. Simple question. A simple question. If the Chinese government has nothing to hide regarding Xinjiang, if these really are so called voluntary vocational centers, then why are they so cranky and so uneasy about outside questions? If they have nothing to hide, then they've nothing to fear. They should be transparent and open. You know, and I'll close with this point. When Xi Jinping came into power, when the transition of power happened 6 years ago, there was some mild optimism that he would be a reformer. What's happened on Xi's watch? China has become even more authoritarian. The human rights situation has got far worse. And what's happening in Xinjiang is absolutely repugnant. Now, this is not the first time that China's had tensions with its Muslim minorities. Very little known fact, both in the West and in China, in the 19th century, there were some very, very violent conflicts. And I'm not saying it was all one sided, but it's just an example of the response that various Chinese regimes have taken. In this case, I'm talking about the Qing dynasty, the Dungan Revolt, the Yellow Turban Rebellion. We're talking millions dead in those conflicts. We're talking about between the 1860s and the 1890s. So China actually has a history. This is nothing new. There is a history of China putting down its Muslim minorities. And the world is silent. Why does the world obsess over Israel? And I'm not saying everything Israel does is right, but why does the world obsess over Israel, but candidly, basically, blatantly ignore what is going on in China? Could it be that China is the world's second biggest economy? It's a major power. It's a permanent UN Security Council member. Could it be that the world is frightened of the dragon? To me, this is all the more reason why we shouldn't be pandering to the Beijing regime, why we absolutely shouldn't be humouring any sort of notion when they have little tantrums in Britain or other Western countries about hurt feelings. It's about time the world starts standing up to the Chinese regime. Emperor Xi has made it clear he thinks he could do anything he likes. And when bullies get the way, when thugs get the way, then there's no stopping them. I have utter contempt for the Chinese regime and everything it does and everything it stands for. I think it's vile. I also hate Islamism, but I do not believe this is the way to tackle Islamism, by punishing ordinary Muslims. If anything, in the long term, that will radicalize people. And at some point, there are going to be unpleasant Islamist groups will take a hold in Western China. I think the only reason it hasn't happened is because the security forces are so hardline. Um, and some would say that's a good thing. Now, like I said, China has a right to protect its borders, but this approach, it's just wrong. It's just, it's just wrong. I mean, I can't imagine the anxiety and the heartbreak of people who've had relatives just go missing. This is it's disgraceful. Anyway, credit to Matt Rivers and CNN for bringing that report. I've often been critical of CNN, but it is important that the world's media put pressure on the Chinese regime. And they like to bark and they like to say it's our internal affairs. Well, the Chinese regime has no problem stoking up its diaspora um, in order to, you know, parrot the Communist Party line. I do think that the world needs to be more outspoken. I'd like to see us, instead of pandering to the so-called era of Sino British golden relations, we need to start being more assertive. I know we can't completely cut off trade, but we need to show in a post-Brexit world that we have some backbone and we can stand up to Beijing. And as to Chinese nationals here, welcome them. I wish them all the best. They're guests, but they need to remember that the old communist propaganda line, the old thuggish, our way is the only way attitude, won't be tolerated in the West. So that's how I feel about it.